Yo, what's up? So my fiance and I turned 30 last week, and to celebrate that, we booked a 2-week trip to New York City and to Iceland. We had a great time, thanks for asking, and this trip finally gave me a lot of opportunities to give my Leica Q2 a run for its money. This video will not be a technical review, but more of a report of my real-life experience of using this camera while in New York City. The video about me using the Q2 in Iceland, which was quite different, will be out within a week after this. So subscribe if that's something that you would like to see. In case you're new to this channel, let me just quickly introduce myself. My name is Tobias. I make videos about everyday carry gear, bags, items and tech, and cameras for me often fall into those categories as well. So I make a good amount of camera related videos as well. I started out as a Canon shooter back in the glorious DSLR days, but switched to Fuji back in 2018 because I felt like Canon had abandoned their customer base. I started out buying a Fuji X100F back in 2018 and quickly decided to sell all of my Canon gear afterwards. At the end of 2019 I started this YouTube channel and bought a Fuji X-T30 along with some lenses to be able to shoot proper 4K video. Another few months down the road, when Fuji released the X100V, I also bought that, then bought the X-T4 last summer, and back in November of 2020 I finally decided to buy my Grail camera, the Leica Q2 as well. So in short, before I bought the Leica Q2, I had about 3 years worth of shooting experience with Fuji's X100 line of cameras and over 7 years in total of shooting more serious cameras overall. With that being said, this is just a hobby for me. I do no professional photography whatsoever and I have no ambition to go pro either. I'm just here for the fun and for the memories. So, what has it been like to use the Leica Q2 in New York City? I have to admit that I was a bit hesitant to just bring the Leica Q2 for photos, simply because I haven't had enough time to really get familiar with this camera, and that is why I also brought my full Fuji X-T4 setup along, just in case. As ridiculous as this might sound. Anyway, even though I brought along my Fuji X-T4, I pretty much only used it to shoot video and took 90% of my photos on the Q2. New York City is obviously a wonderful place with tons of opportunities for photography. There is just so much to see and do, so much good food to eat, so many great and unique places to visit that it is pretty much impossible to take it all in within the short time we had there. We sadly didn't have the best of times in terms of the weather we were experiencing. In other words, it was pissing it down on most of the days we were there. So I was glad that the Leica has an IP52 weather resistance rating. I had it out in the rain for hours on end and I have no issues to report whatsoever. With its 28mm lens, it is wide enough for most occasions, and especially in a city like New York, it is nice to have a slightly wider field of view than I would have on a 35mm lens, which is actually my all-time favorite focal length. Most of the shots that I've taken were obviously just for the memories and with little to no artistic ambition whatsoever, but I still like how a lot of them came out. We were very lucky to get a nice complimentary upgrade to our hotel room to the 36th floor with a decent view of the Empire State Building. Shout out to the Embassy Suites Hotel by Hilton at Times Square. Needless to say that I took a couple of photos of the Empire State Building at different times of the day through our window. What seriously stood out to me this time around in New York was how empty the place felt. I mean, we were there 2 years ago in January of 2020 before COVID hit, and back then the city was still buzzing. So I know it's not just the time of the year or the bad weather. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not like the city was empty. After all, there are still millions of people living their regular lives there, but somehow I still didn't feel the same kind of energy, for lack of a better word. There just weren't as many people around swarming the place at all times, and I tried to capture some of that emptiness in my shots as well. On the upside, that also meant that we could simply go into every store or restaurant or whatever without having to worry about standing in line or not getting in. Even at Broadway, we could just get a ticket to Wicked at the same night of the show without any issues. Granted, we had to sit pretty far back and the place was packed, but still, we bought our tickets last minute online and barely even made it to the show in time. As for other things to do whilst in New York, one of the more touristy yet awesome things that we did there was definitely visiting the Vanderbilt Summit. From there, you get an incredible 360-degree view over the city, as well as some nice optical illusions with all those mirrors. Other than that, there's also just so much incredible food to enjoy everywhere around the city. But the two types of food that actually stood out the most to me were one, Juice Generation, who just have the greatest smoothies and acai bowls that I've ever tried, and those street food stands that you get all over the city. There's one gyro stand in particular that we always like to go back to. It's on Lafayette Street, right across REI, and the spicy lamb gyro there is just out of this world. It's all freshly chopped up and diced together, full of spices and flavor, so if you're ever in New York, you should definitely give it a try. There's also a little donut place, simply called Dough, that sells handmade donuts, and I honestly never understood why people love donuts so much, but the donuts they sell there just got me hooked like a drug. They ain't cheap, but I would definitely recommend them. Back to the camera though, I don't think that I have to say much about the image quality of the Leica. The low light performance with the f1.7 lens, the full frame sensor and IBIS came in clutch a lot, especially in these kinds of weather conditions and at this time of the year. With the 42 megapixel images, everything looks crispy and sharp. The colors straight out of camera are vibrant, but not in a way that feels artificial. By the way, all of the images shown in this video are unedited, unless stated otherwise. I will edit some of them for sure, so if you're interested in seeing my best shots with a bit of post-processing, feel free to follow me on Instagram as well. In conclusion, the Leica Q2 actually met all of my travel photography needs for New York and then some. Yes, I did also bring the X-T4 and a bunch of lenses, and yes, I also took a couple of photos with it, but for the most part I only used it to shoot video, and if I could go again next week, I would most likely just leave it at home. I used the Sony ZV-1 for the majority of my vlog type of shots, and I'm always just astonished by the quality that this tiny camera puts out. Another thing that I was actually quite surprised about was that I never felt limited by only having one lens on the Leica. Somehow it always just felt right. At the same time, the image quality with the Summilux lens and the full frame sensor is just everything that I could have asked for. Because of its weather resistance and overall build quality, I never felt uncomfortable using it even in the worst conditions, which was even more important for our time in Iceland, but I will save that for the next video. And finally, even though that is just a side note, the Q2 is also just a beautiful object to behold and just nice to have and carry with you. I personally love the design and aesthetic as well as the haptics and the dials of this camera. It just feels like a tank, and that is also part of the reason why I simply cannot ever leave home without it anymore. To sum it up, the Leica Q2 was all the camera I needed to shoot photos on this trip. It performed flawlessly even in the worst of conditions, and I'm really happy with the images that I got. As I said in the beginning, I'm still in the process of getting used to this camera, simply because I didn't have enough time to use it in the weeks leading up to this trip, but I am starting to feel more and more comfortable with it. If I could do the whole trip again, I would most likely just leave the Fuji X-T4 at home, even though I certainly do love that camera as well. But me personally, I prefer to have a lighter setup and not having to think about whether or not I should switch to a different lens at any given moment. This is personal preference though, and I absolutely do get why other people might disagree. But anyway, that's all I got for you today. Again, if you would like to see more about my experience using this camera in Iceland, stay tuned for the next video. Until then, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. Until next time, take care.